Alright, another Knives Sports Adventures video here. Today, this is a knife that I'm really excited about. So today I'm going to be talking about the SOG Kiku XR LTE. So the SOG Kiku came out a few years ago. I liked it. I liked the design. I liked the blade shape. I liked a lot of things about it. What I didn't like about it was that it was so heavy, right, for a knife of its size. So the original version of the SOG Kiku was 5.6 ounces. And that is not a hugely unreasonable weight for a knife until you take into account the size of the knife. So this knife, the LTE version, the light version, weighs just a hair over 4 ounces. This one we're looking at 4.3 ounces, which is reasonable for a really sturdy knife of this size. But if you're looking in the 5 ounce range, we're looking at much larger knives. This is 5.5 ounces. This is my line steel Kerr, and this is a really sturdily built knife. And you can see it's a much larger blade. It's a larger handle. There's a lot of knife you can carry for 5.5 ounces. This is, we're looking into, Benchmade Crooked River territory. That's 5.4 ounces. Just look at how much larger of a knife that is, right? You can carry significantly more cutting power and still have a really sturdy, overbuilt knife for 5.5 ounces. So it didn't really make sense for me to have one at that weight, which is why I didn't buy the regular version. But I'm really excited about the LTE version, the light version, because it's more reasonable, and this is just a very nicely designed knife. So let's get into what's going on with this knife. We're looking at steel, CTS XHP steel. Which I had on one knife before, but nothing I'd done extensive testing with. We've got micarta or G10 outer scales here. This one I believe is G10. You got carbon fiber liners, which that's what allowed them to save over an ounce off the weight of this knife, was going from a carbon fiber liner to a rather than the steel liner that they usually have. I'll talk a little bit about that later because there's some engineering stuff with that is interesting to me, and it wouldn't be possible with certain other knives. So first of all, ergonomics of this knife are fantastic. It's got really good bearing flipper action. It is possible to make it fail, but with any kind of reasonable amount of flip, that's okay. Pretty decent action. SOG has done what they're supposed to do, and they've learned from past mistakes. The flipper is now big enough. It's got a good angle. It's got good jimping on it. It's been skeletonized to save a little bit of weight there. The handle is really comfortable. So one benefit of having those carbon fiber liners is the carbon fiber is a bit thicker than steel would be, which means it doesn't press as much into your hand. And when you're using this knife, it's very comfortable. It's almost as comfortable as a fixed blade knife, which is not typical of folders because you have this big gap in the middle. So really, really nice. When I was doing my sharpness testing, I very much appreciated that. The other thing that's really cool about this knife is the blade shape. So you can see they've done a little bit of a recurve here before sweeping the blade back. And on the recurve portion, you can see there they've actually done a hollow grind. And then this is kind of like the saber grind where this part is flat and then you have the ridge in the middle on the tip portion to give you more tip thickness and more tip strength. Really, really thick blade, but because of this grind, it still cuts very well. I love this knife for carving into wood, for making hot dog sticks and stuff for campfires. It just cuts excellently with that recurve. I love recurve knives, and this one is a good example of why I like that. Given that the blade is so thick and so short, I expected that to be more of a problem than it was, but the grind has just been done so well that that's not an issue. One thing that was a little bit tough with this is stuff like opening boxes. Shoving it in under a narrow gap under the tape was actually a little more difficult than I anticipated because of the thickness of that blade. But for anything else, it wasn't a big deal. I don't 100% like how much they've curved that knife back this way. I would prefer that to be a little straighter just so you don't get things slipping off there, especially with such a short blade. But the recurve really saves this knife. A knife that's built this sturdy, this size, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Sometimes, unless you're a fan of something like the Benchmade 300. This is the previous, premium axis lock flipper knife. It used to be the only one available, really. It's about the same size. It's got a very similar blade shape, similar thickness, etc. But this one was never a bearing flipper. The Benchmade was never on bearings. It was always on bushings. So it was always a little bit harder to flip open. The action was never real great on these. This is definitely an upgrade in every sense. Take a look at the weights real quick on the Benchmade. I know these are out of production, so it's not a huge relevant thing. Benchmade's 4.8 ounces. This one's 4.3. Again, much more in line with where a knife of that size should be. There's another knife. There's a zero tolerance, 801 tie. That's a 5.7 ounce knife. It's a big all metal knife. That's what you should be looking at for that much weight. So much better decision for lighter weight on this knife. The other thing I want to really talk about with this knife is the steel. So in the summertime, when it's hot and sweaty outside, that sweat tends to get on knives and corrode the edges off or make the actions corrode really easily. Usually I carry a Spyderco in LC200N steel in the summertime because that's the only thing I can really carry and keep an edge on. If I'm carrying D2 in the summertime, that knife is dull whether I've used it or not in 3 or 4 days. This is actually a legitimate summer carry for me because the corrosion resistance on the CTS XHP steel is so good. I purposely didn't oil this knife and carried it for about a month, and it still had a usable edge on it, which is much better corrosion resistance than you typically see from a non-nitrogen steel knife. So that's excellent. Edge testing on this, when I did my full testing on it, this did about 150 cuts before it started tearing paper. I suspect it probably would have done better than that if the blade weren't so thick on the shoulders. I think that was contributing to part of why it was tearing, because it wasn't having any rolling or anything like that, although it was duller. So good edge retention on this. Let's go ahead and get into the disassembly and kind of show you what's going on here, because there are some interesting things going on with the construction, and I'll talk about that more as we get in here. One thing I do want to mention as well is the fin out the back here. I've had issues with that on previous SOG knives because it kind of cuts into your hand and gets in the way. On this one, it's not as bad because they've made it out of the carbon fiber, which is thicker, so there's more surface area there to encounter your hand and not cause it to dig in and irritate your hand. So we're going for the pivot point here first. I have not disassembled this yet, so you'll see it for the first time with me here. Pivot comes out nice and easy. We'll go down to the T6 for the other pins, the other bolts. I'm going to take all the bolts out of one side first, and then see where that gets me with the scales. I love the XR lock. I like it better than the Axis lock because it's not as much of a pain to assemble and disassemble, because those caps come off of the sides and let you get to it a lot more easily as far as assembling things. So there's the cap, there's the spring, and you can see that really cool looking carbon fiber liner there. It's even skeletonized, which saves even more weight. So that's pretty cool. So I want to point out at this point why the carbon fiber liner is such a big deal and why this hasn't been done on any axis lock knives or anything. So axis locks knives, you'll notice, always have a steel liner, because with a round axis lock bar that has a round end on it, what ends up happening is this surface right here at the back of the liner, where the bar contacts the liner, is where it takes all the stress of the lock pushing this way against the action of the blade trying to close. I don't think carbon fiber would hold up on a knife with an axis lock, because there's so much pressure on that one little point. What happens with an XR lock is you've got this big long cap here, right? And that cap runs up against the scale, which is G10. So rather than just having the lock pushing on something, what you have is this entire long surface of the XR lock button pushing up against the entire long surface of the G10 scale, and that spreads out the force, which allows you to have a knife like this with carbon fiber liners and not wear out immediately. I've been carrying this for a couple months. I'll take a look as I get further in here, but I don't see any visible signs of wear on that carbon fiber, which is my main concern about this knife. That's the only thing I really could see that could be a durability issue on this knife, because everything else is kind of overbuilt. Again, which is why the knife is so heavy, and I didn't buy the previous version. So let's see if we can get this liner off here. Fits very tight. There's some studs on the screws there at the bottom. Trying to do this without putting my fingers in danger. I'm really surprised at how tightly that is on there. It's going to take some doing to get that back on there. Normally I would take my time with that. Let's pop this out. See if we can speed that up a little bit for the video by taking out the other sides too. Okay, so that is a pin that's spinning in this side. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this out, because it looks like those pivots are not keyed, or the pins or the bolt things that you run the bolts into, the barrel things in there, are not keyed, so that one's spinning on me, not allowing me to take that out. This one's coming out okay. And then these are the clip bolts. These are coming out with a T8, although I'm not sure those could actually be small Allen bolts. So the pocket clip kind of goes on underneath of the scale. There's the pocket clip, slides out that way. And then we've got this one that's still kind of stuck on because of that bolt there. So I'm going to grab a screwdriver and see if we can carefully lever off the carbon fiber liner without breaking anything. Now it's coming off easier, now that I've relieved some of that tension on the other side with the other bolt. This is the spot right here. That's the one that was giving me trouble. Pull that down. everything fits together really tightly on here. Okay, so there is the metal plate on the inside there that the pocket clip goes into. I don't see any metal reinforcing the liner where the lock is. I was wondering if they did that. Looks like they have a little washer here reinforcing the carbon fiber where the bearings go. So that just slides into there. There's still a good bit of carbon fiber in there. They didn't thin it out too much, which I was concerned about, so that's a good thing. You can see the bearings are recessed into the blade there. Pretty good recess, but the blade is so thick. There's still plenty of metal there. I wouldn't expect that to be too much of a weak point. Yeah, they've skeletonized the blade here, around the pivot a little bit, but again, there's so much thickness there that it still is a pretty overbuilt knife, and the blade is relatively short, so there's not going to be as much leverage back and forth on that blade as there would with a really long blade. So overall, I like the design. I think that's pretty well made. Here is the pivot. You can see the bolt actually goes in both sides of it, which I didn't realize before. But it is keyed so the middle part doesn't spin once you get it through that carbon fiber liner. There's the stop pin. It just pulls out, but it's very, very tight, so I'm not going to lever that out. You would just have to work it out slowly, because they put it tightly into that carbon fiber so that it doesn't slop around and wear, because carbon fiber would wear faster than steel would for sure. So it looks like they've done a pretty good job of transitioning this knife from steel liners to carbon fiber liners. I really like this knife. It's become one of my favorite carries. So be looking for that knife, and I hope that review is helpful and informative, and keep adventuring.